Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are wading into a topic that feels like it is constantly dominating the headlines and dictating global security policies.
Right, and yet it is so rarely understood in its full, sprawling historical context.
Exactly. We are looking at the incredibly complex 80-year geopolitical triangle between Israel, Iran, and the United States.
And we are talking about a massive historical arc here, stretching from 1945 all the way up to the present day.
To do this justice, we aren't just looking at a few news summaries. We are pulling from a substantial stack of sources that you, the listener, have provided for us.
Yes, we have an academic-grade, highly sourced historical analysis in front of us.
We are talking about declassified CIA documents, comprehensive think tank assessments, detailed timeline summaries, and peer-reviewed international relations theory.
The documentation is extensive.
It is. Now, our mission for this deep dive is to map out the structural realignments of these three nations. We want to chart the path from when they were quiet strategic allies to when they became overt adversaries.
But before we get into the timeline, there is a necessary foundation we need to establish regarding the nature of these sources.
Yes, I have a crucial directive to share with you. The sources we are exploring today contain highly politically charged historical and contemporary events.
Very charged.
So I must explicitly state to you that neither of us here at the table are taking sides. We are not endorsing any viewpoints, and we are absolutely not injecting any political bias into this analysis.
Right. Our goal today is purely academic and educational.
We are here to unpack the historical facts and interpretations exactly as they are presented in the source material, so that you can understand the broader structural arc of this 80-year conflict.
And that is a vital foundation to lay, because to understand the present tensions between Israel, Iran, and the United States, we must begin not with the missiles that dominate today's news cycle, but with memory.
Memory and structure.
Precisely. History does not move in explosions. It moves in slow tectonic shifts. These are structural realignments that only appear sudden when they finally breach the surface.
So if we want to understand the modern Middle East, we have to look past the immediate crises.
You have to start with the foundational architecture of the Cold War.
Okay, let's wind the clock back. Let's rewind to the decades immediately following the Second World War, from roughly 1945 to 1979.
A very different era.
And what is so jarring for many people to realize today is that during this period, Iran and Israel were not enemies. They weren't even just neutral toward each other.
No, they were quite aligned in specific ways.
Under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran was aligned very closely with the United States.
This was part of a broader post-WWII American strategic posture. It was built around Soviet containment, securing access to petroleum resources, and maintaining stability for a Western-aligned regime.
Right. The geopolitical architecture of the time was defined by a series of American doctrines. You had the Truman Doctrine in 1947, the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957.
And later, the Nixon Doctrine. These frameworks established a system where regional proxies, principally Iran under the Shah and intermittently Israel, served as vital instruments of American power projection.
The United States was looking at the map of the Middle East and seeing a massive vulnerability to Soviet expansion. They needed an anchor.
They did. But the foundational event that truly cemented the U.S.-Shah alliance and arguably set the stage for the next 70 years of blowback occurred in 1953.
The 1953 coup against Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, Operation Ajax.
Yes. Our sources point to declassified CIA documents, specifically those held at the National Security Archive at George Washington University, released to the public in 2013.
And these documents confirm that the coup was carried out under direct CIA and British MI6 direction as an explicit act of foreign policy.
The details in these archives are quite striking. You look at Kermit Roosevelt's operational memoranda.
He was a CIA officer on the ground running the operation, right?
Exactly. And the CIA wasn't just observing the political instability in Tehran, they were actively engineering it.
The records detail the use of cash payments handed out to newspaper editors to plant anti-Mossadegh propaganda.
They paid off street factions and hired agitators to stage massive, violent riots. They even went so far as to fabricate a fake communist party.
Right, having operatives run around threatening religious leaders in the name of communism.
All of this was designed to completely destabilize the democratically elected Mossadegh government and push the populace into accepting a strongman.
The end result of all this manufactured chaos was the consolidation of absolute power by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
The US and the UK got what they wanted. They secured a pro-Western anchor against the Soviets, who was willing to cooperate on oil access.
But the long-term implications of Operation Ajax really cannot be overstated.
No, they can't. Yes, it bound Iran's modernization trajectory entirely to American patronage, which looked like a massive strategic win for Washington in the 1950s.
But simultaneously, it created a deep popular resentment within Iran.
It delegitimized the Shah in the eyes of many Iranians, essentially branding him as a Western proxy. That resentment would act as the subterranean fuel for the 1979 revolution.
Now, while this U.S.-Iran relationship was being intensely forged, Israel, which had just been established in 1948, was looking at the regional map.
And realizing it was surrounded by states actively hostile to its existence.
Which brings us to a crucial strategic concept introduced by Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, the periphery doctrine.
The periphery doctrine is fascinating from a geopolitical standpoint.
Israel is surrounded by hostile Arab neighbors, Egypt, Syria, Jordan. So Ben-Gurion's strategy was essentially to leapfrog those immediate borders.
If the inner ring of the Middle East is hostile, you forge alliances with the non-Arab states forming the outer ring, the periphery.
According to the analysis by Yossi Alfer provided in your sources, this doctrine led to the formation of a highly covert, highly effective strategic triad involving Israel, Iran, and Turkey.
It was a strategy born of sheer geographic and demographic necessity. Israel needed to outflank the wave of Arab nationalism championed by figures like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Because Nasser was actively unifying the Arab world against Israel.
Exactly. So they formed what Alfred describes as an Israeli-Iranian-Turkish intelligence triad as early as the 1950s.
And the level of clandestine cooperation between Israel and Iran during this time is one of those historical facts that runs completely counter to our modern assumptions.
We are so accustomed to seeing them as mortal enemies.
But according to the timeline summary in our sources, in 1949, Iran actually became the second Muslim-majority country, just after Turkey, to officially recognize the State of Israel.
It was a pragmatic recognition, but a profound one structurally.
And it didn't stop at diplomatic recognition. From that point on, Iran actively facilitated the transit of Iraqi Jews fleeing persecution, allowing them to cross Iranian territory to reach the new Jewish state.
In addition to that, Iran supplied a massive portion of Israel's oil.
Which is critical for a young nation with absolutely zero domestic energy resources of its own.
And then you look at the intelligence sharing. It was deeply institutionalized via dedicated channels between Iran's Savak, the Shah's secret police, and Israel's Mossad.
They even had Israeli military advisors operating on the ground within Iran.
Which brings us to a massive debate among historians about this era. Was this tight Iran-Israel relationship ideological, or was it purely strategic?
When we dive into the research, particularly the work of scholars like Trita Parsi in his book Treacherous Alliance, as well as Roham Alvandi's analysis, they argue it was overwhelmingly strategic.
These are scholars who dug through the archives and interviewed the key players. And they are remarkably clear on this point. It was a mutual convenience.
But you have two non-Arab states, both allied with the United States, both facing a massive wave of Soviet-backed Arab nationalism. Wasn't there some civilizational kinship there?
It's tempting to look for that emotional or ideological bond, but the sources indicate it was a pragmatic entente, not a values-based alliance.
Parsi demonstrates that the Shah viewed Israel as a highly useful tool. By aligning quietly with Israel, the Shah strengthened Tehran's own standing in Washington.
He also used Israeli intelligence and military know-how to weaken mutual Arab rivals, particularly neighboring Iraq, which was a constant security concern for Iran.
Israel, on the other hand, didn't necessarily endorse the Shah's domestic policies, but they valued Iran as the absolute keystone of its non-Arab periphery system.
It was a marriage of convenience, and to prove it wasn't ideological, the sources point to the Zahedi papers held at the Hoover Library at Stanford.
Right. These papers confirm that the Shah maintained clandestine ties with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, at the exact same time he was cooperating with Israeli intelligence.
And he publicly criticized Israeli occupation after the 1967 Six-Day War.
So he wasn't driven by a shared Zionist ideology. He was driven by the cold, realist logic of state survival and keeping the regional balance tilted in his favor.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the massive structural break. Because if a relationship is built purely on the cold calculations of state interest under one specific monarch, what happens when that regime is violently overthrown?
Right. What happens when the state fundamentally changes its entire identity?
Yeah.
So the 1970s come to a close and the entire chessboard gets flipped over.
February 1979, the Islamic Revolution completely overthrows the Shah.
Ayatollah Khomeini returns from exile, takes power, and replaces a pro-Western, secularly oriented monarchy with an Islamic republic.
And the ideological reframing is instant and stark. It wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a total cosmological shift in how the state viewed the world.
The new regime embedded opposition to Israel into the very constitutional and theological architecture of the Islamic Republic.
Ayatollah Khomeini declared Israel an enemy of Islam. The United States was dubbed the Great Satan, and Israel was labeled the Little Satan.
All diplomatic ties were immediately severed, and in a highly symbolic move, the Israeli embassy in Tehran was seized and handed over to the PLO.
And then the relationship with the United States completely collapses with the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis, which begins in November 1979.
American diplomats are seized and held hostage for 444 days. This crisis freezes approximately $8 billion in Iranian assets.
It profoundly traumatizes American domestic politics and directly contributes to Jimmy Carter losing the presidential election to Ronald Reagan.
The strategic triangle we just spent time outlining, which had been relatively stable, suddenly fractures into a triangle of intense public hostility.
The revolution permanently altered regional alignments in three very specific ways that are vital to understand.
Let's break this down.
First, it eliminated the largest non-Arab partner in Israel's periphery doctrine system overnight. Israel's outer shield was gone.
Second, it created a revolutionary state in Iran that was actively committed to exporting its model across the region. They weren't content to stay within their borders.
And third, it injected a specifically Shia Islamist dimension into Middle Eastern geopolitics that simply had not existed before as a state-level driving force.
But history rarely draws a straight line. You have this massive ideological rupture. You have public rallies calling for the destruction of the U.S. and Israel.
But then the 1980s happened.
Specifically, the Iran-Iraq War breaks out in 1980 and grinds on until 1988. And this war forces a profoundly contradictory reality.
It exposes the absolute paradox of the era. Despite Iran's revolutionary, hostile rhetoric toward Israel and the U.S., covert arms flows continued throughout the conflict.
The defining event here is the Iran-Contra affair of 1985 and 1986.
If you look at the congressional transcripts from the Iran-Contra investigations in our notes, the numbers are sobering.
So it's 1985, Iran is publicly calling for Israel's destruction, yet Israel is secretly acting as the initial conduit for American TOW anti-tank missiles to Iran.
The timeline in the sources specifies that 96 of these missiles were delivered in August 1985, and another 408 missiles were delivered in September 1985.
Eventually, the operation is restructured, and the Enterprise, a private entity run by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, begins selling arms directly to Iran.
And then illegally funnels the profits to the Nicaraguan Contras in Central America.
It is a dizzying web of contradiction. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to ask why this happened. Why would Israel arm its declared enemy?
A thesis from Portland State University analyzing Israeli agency in the Iran-Contra affair provides the grim strategic calculation.
For Iran, the imperative was sheer survival. They were facing a massive Iraqi invasion ordered by Saddam Hussein, featuring human wave attacks and chemical weapons.
And Iran had very limited access to Western arms because of the hostage crisis embargo. Their military hardware was American-made from the Shah's era, and they desperately needed spare parts and missiles.
So Tehran quietly accepted weapons from its declared ideological enemies.
Exactly. And for Israel, the calculation was equally cold-blooded. They looked at the map and determined that a weakened but surviving Iran was vastly preferable to a victorious Iraqi military machine under Saddam Hussein.
Saddam was seen as the immediate conventional threat to Israel's Eastern Front. Let Iran and Iraq bleed each other out.
So let's summarize the sheer complexity of this triangle in 1985.
The U.S. has declared a strict arms embargo on Iran, while secretly channeling weapons to them through Israel to get American hostages out of Lebanon.
Israel is actively arming a radical regime that is constitutionally committed to its destruction.
And Iran, the vanguard of the Islamic Revolution, is accepting military lifelines from the Great Satan and the Little Satan.
It is a textbook example of public rhetorical hostility masking deeply pragmatic cooperation. Trita Parsi concludes that Iran's double policy successfully veiled a consistent pursuit of state survival.
This contradiction is analytically vital for you, the listener. to understand, because it demonstrates that the realist logic of state survival consistently overrides ideological commitments.
So the 80s are defined by this contradiction, but then the calendar flips to the 1990s, and the entire chessboard gets flipped over yet again.
The 1991 Gulf War fundamentally degrades Saddam Hussein's military in Iraq, and later that same year, the Soviet Union collapses entirely.
Parsi identifies this as the decisive geopolitical earthquake. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union and Iraq were the two principal threats that had quietly bound Israel and Iran together.
Even if only as tacit, covert partners.
But suddenly, those common enemies are gone. And in this new regional order, Israel and Iran find themselves looking around the Middle East and realizing they are now the two primary powers left standing.
They are competing to define the post-Cold War balance of power. The strategic recalculations from both sides are fascinating. Let's look at Israel first.
According to Marta Furlan's research published in International Affairs around 1992, Israeli politicians began deliberately shifting their rhetoric.
They started painting the regime in Tehran not just as a regional nuisance, but as an irrational, existential threat to global stability.
The source material argues this was a deliberate rhetorical strategy to ensure the West, specifically the United States, remained closely aligned with Israel now that the Soviet threat had vanished.
Israel needed a new unifier to keep American military and diplomatic support locked in, and this strategy succeeds.
It succeeds brilliantly. It leads directly to the Clinton administration's dual containment policy, formally announced in May 1993 by Martin Indyk.
This policy fundamentally shifted American strategy, treating both Iran and Iraq as actively hostile to American interests, effectively isolating Iran economically and diplomatically.
And Iran, recognizing this shifting landscape and feeling the pressure of dual containment, begins a massive generational strategic project of its own.
The construction of what they call the axis of resistance. Now let's break down what this actually entails based on the academic sources.
It is a sprawling network of state and non-state allies spanning the entire region. You have Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian territories.
The Assad regime in Syria, and later on Shia militias in Iraq and the Houthis down in Yemen.
It is a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. The sources note this axis served three vital structural functions for Iran.
First, it allowed a Persian Shia nation to project massive influence deep into the Arab heartland.
Second, it created a deterrent ring of fire around Israel's borders.
And third, it provided Iran with strategic depth against American military power. If the U.S. or Israel wanted to strike Tehran, they would have to deal with a rain of rockets from Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria first.
Researchers point out that this axis completely transformed Iran from a distant, over-the-horizon concern into an immediate, existential-level security threat for Israel.
This was particularly evident after the 2006 Lebanon war. That conflict revealed to Israeli intelligence just how deep Iranian involvement was in Hezbollah's military capability.
We are talking about highly advanced anti-ship missiles, massive underground bunker complexes, and sophisticated command and control.
Because a direct state-on-state war was seen as far too costly for both sides, they engaged in what the Survival Journal in 2024 termed everything short of war.
Everything short of war. It perfectly encapsulates the era from the late 90s through the 2010s. It was a Cold War, fought in the shadows with lethal consequences.
Let's examine the tactics of this shadow war, starting with cyber operations.
The Stuxnet worm, discovered in 2010. This is a massive analytical milestone.
The sources emphasize that Stuxnet is the first known instance in history of malware engineered specifically to cause physical damage to real-world infrastructure.
Prior to Stuxnet, malware might steal data. Stuxnet was designed to physically destroy industrial machines.
It was attributed jointly to the intelligence services of the U.S. and Israel. It infiltrated the Natanz nuclear facility in Iran, specifically targeting the programmable logic controllers that manage the centrifuges.
The malware caused the centrifuges to spin out of control and tear themselves apart, but it simultaneously played back normal data readings to the operators in the control room.
So they had no idea their machines were physically disintegrating. It destroyed approximately 1,000 centrifuges and set back Iran's enrichment program significantly.
And when cyber warfare wasn't enough, the shadow war turned to kinetic, lethal action. Between 2007 and 2020, we saw a relentless assassination and sabotage campaign.
At least 10 high-level Iranian nuclear scientists were killed in a series of attacks inside Iran, widely attributed to Israel's Mossad.
The culmination of this campaign was the November 2020 assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. He was the chief architect of their nuclear research.
He was killed by a remote-controlled satellite-linked machine gun mounted in a pickup truck that utilized artificial intelligence to target him. It highlights the sheer technological disparity in this shadow war.
Alongside the cyber attacks and assassinations, you have the Syrian theater. Throughout the 2010s, as Syria collapsed into civil war, it became a massive arena of indirect confrontation.
Israel launched hundreds of airstrikes targeting Iranian military infrastructure, weapons shipments, and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps personnel operating in Syria.
They were specifically hunting what the sources call the Precision Missile Project.
This was Iran's attempt to upgrade Hezbollah's massive arsenal of unguided rockets into highly accurate, GPS-guided munitions that could pinpoint critical Israeli infrastructure.
Israel essentially fought a decade-long air campaign to stop those guidance kits from crossing the Syrian border into Lebanon.
If we step back and compare this to the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, the analytical comparison is apt, but deeply imperfect.
In the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, there were formal rules of the game, hotlines between Washington and Moscow, and a massive arms control architecture to prevent accidental escalation.
Between Israel and Iran, there were no hotlines. It was a purely asymmetrical balance of power.
Israel possessed overwhelming conventional military superiority, absolute dominance of the airspace, and an undeclared but universally acknowledged nuclear arsenal.
Like Iran, unable to match Israel conventionally, relied on asymmetric capabilities, proxy militias, and the strategic depth provided by its ring of fire.
Speaking of undeclared nuclear arsenals and enrichment programs, that brings us to the core of the modern tension, the nuclear chessboard.
The issue that turned a regional rivalry into a global crisis. But the origins of Iran's nuclear program actually trace back to the 1950s under the United States' own Atoms for Peace initiative.
The Shah had massive ambitions for his country. By 1974, he had established the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran and planned to build massive nuclear capacity.
The U.S. and European nations were actively helping him build out this infrastructure.
The program was suspended after the 1979 revolution because Ayatollah Khomeini initially viewed nuclear technology as un-Islamic, but it quietly restarted in the mid-1980s during the Iran-Iraq War.
By 1987, Iran was acquiring centrifuge designs from the Pakistani AQ Khan black market network.
The irony here is that the United States essentially laid the foundation for the very nuclear program they are sanctioning decades later.
The real turning point, when this becomes the central axis of global confrontation, is 2002. An Iranian dissident group reveals the existence of massive, undeclared nuclear facilities at Natanz and a heavy water reactor at Iraq.
From that moment on, we see a rapid escalation of international pressure. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, refers Iran to the UN Security Council in 2006.
This leads to 4 rounds of crippling global sanctions. The U.S. builds an unprecedented financial architecture to isolate the Iranian economy from the global banking system,
which ultimately forces Iran to the negotiating table, culminating in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, universally known as the JCPOA.
Let's look at the parameters of that agreement. Under the JCPOA, Iran agreed to verifiable concessions. They reduced their enriched uranium stockpile by 98%.
They went from having tons of enriched uranium to just 300 kilograms. They cut their operating centrifuges by 2/3 and agreed to use only the oldest IR-1 models.
And they accepted highly intrusive 247 IAEA inspections. In exchange, they received relief from those economic and oil sanctions.
If you look at the objective assessment from SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, they concluded that the agreement was technically profoundly sound.
And the IAEA consistently found that Iran was fully living up to its technical undertakings.
But if SIPRI and the IAEA said the deal was technically sound, why was there such fierce pushback from Israel and Saudi Arabia?
That is the crux of the geopolitical divide. Israel and Saudi Arabia argued that the JCPOA was a fatal strategic error because of its sunset clauses.
Meaning the restrictions on enrichment eventually expired after 10 to 15 years. Furthermore, the deal did nothing to address Iran's ballistic missile program or its funding of the Axis of Resistance.
From Israel's perspective, the U.S. was unfreezing billions of dollars that Iran would funnel to Hezbollah and Hamas while only delaying the nuclear program.
And that political opposition wins out in May 2018 when President Donald Trump formally withdraws the United States from the JCPOA and reinstates the maximum pressure sanctions campaign.
SIPRI framed the 2018 U.S. withdrawal not as an evidence-based technical objection to Iranian noncompliance, but purely as a political measure aimed at collapsing the Iranian economy.
The consequences of that withdrawal were profound. The entire diplomatic framework was shattered.
The result, Iran systematically begins breaching the JCPOA limits. They start enriching uranium to 60% purity.
Weapons-grade uranium is 90%. Going from 3.6% to 60% is the hard part. Jumping from 60 to 90 is a very short technical leap.
They install massive cascades of advanced centrifuges. They suspend the additional protocol, essentially blinding the IAEA inspectors.
By 2023, U.S. military officials assessed that Iran's breakout time, the time it would take to enrich an fissile material for one nuclear bomb, had shrunk to a terrifying 10 to 15 days.
This raises an important question that scholars and intelligence agencies grapple with. Was Iran's primary driver actually building a nuclear weapon, or was the program itself about regime security?
The academic evidence heavily supports a dual motivation thesis. The nuclear program serves as a tool for national pride, a potent deterrent against regime change, and a massive diplomatic bargaining chip.
The Center for Eastern Studies notes that Iran's policy was to reach a point of latency. They want to be a threshold state where producing a weapon depends solely on a political decision, not technical limitations.
Our sources note a fascinating divergence in intelligence. As recently as March 2025, U.S. intelligence formally assessed that Iran was not actively building a nuclear weapon and had not resumed the specific weaponization program suspended in 2003.
But Israeli intelligence vehemently disagreed with that American assessment.
They cited intelligence suggesting Iran could be ready for actual nuclear tests within 6 to 13 months. This massive divergence highlights the deep structural instability.
Israel viewed the mere capability, the threshold status, as an imminent existential threat that had to be neutralized.
And that profound instability brings us to the climax of our timeline, where the decades-long shadow war transitions into direct, state-on-state conventional engagement.
We are looking at the 2020s up to the climax in 2025. The catalyst for this final sequence, according to the sources, is the October 7, 2023 attacks by Hamas.
Following those attacks, the unwritten rules of the shadow war were burned. Israel embarked on a systematic campaign to fundamentally dismantle Iran's conventional deterrent, the axis of resistance.
Throughout 2023 and 2024, Hamas's military capacity as a governing force in Gaza was largely destroyed.
Hezbollah in Lebanon was severely degraded by Israeli air campaigns and ground incursions, culminating in the assassination of its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, in the autumn of 2024.
And crucially, in December 2024, the Assad regime in Syria completely collapses under the weight of renewed rebel offensives,
which physically severs the vital geographic land bridge in Iran's proxy network. The deterrence equilibrium that had kept the Cold War relatively stable for 20 years was shattering.
Iran's outer shield was gone, and the decisive threshold is crossed in April 2024. Iran launches Operation True Promise.
They fire a massive barrage of approximately 300 drones and ballistic missiles directly from Iranian soil at Israeli territory, in retaliation for Israel bombing an Iranian diplomatic facility in Damascus.
This is a massive psychological and strategic line crossed. It is the first ever direct Iranian strike on Israeli soil in history.
Israel retaliates with a precision strike on an air defense radar in Isfahan. Then Iran launches a second salvo of 180 ballistic missiles in October 2024.
The pattern of direct state-on-state missile exchange is now firmly established. The proxy buffer is gone.
We have a dismantled axis of resistance, an unrestrained nuclear enrichment program, and two nations now perfectly willing to fire ballistic missiles at each other's capitals.
It all culminates in what the EU Institute for Security Studies calls a watershed moment. June 2025. The 12-day war, also known as Operation Rising Lion.
The figures detailed in the sources regarding Operation Rising Lion are absolutely stark. Fearing an imminent nuclear breakout, Israel launches a massive conventional strike package.
Over the course of 12 days, they hit over 200 targets deep inside Iran, using approximately 300 heavy munitions.
They target the heavily fortified enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordo, the conversion facility at Isfahan, and the heavy water reactor at Iraq.
They also hit air defense networks, IRGC missile bases, and critical energy infrastructure to cripple the state's ability to respond.
The decapitation of Iranian leadership is severe. Over 30 senior Iranian security chiefs and 11 top-tier nuclear scientists are killed in these strikes.
But perhaps the most significant structural shift in this entire 12-day war is the involvement of the United States.
Initially, U.S. involvement was strictly limited to intelligence sharing and defensive interceptions. But the sources note a critical escalation.
On June 22, the U.S. formally joined the offensive operations. They deployed stealth bombers using massive 30,000-pound high-penetration bunker-buster bombs to strike the deeply buried centrifuge facilities at Fordo and Natanz.
The momentum of domestic political dynamics and intense Israeli pressure drew Washington directly into the offensive strikes.
And Iran retaliates with everything they have left. Multiple waves of sophisticated missiles and drone swarms strike Israeli military bases, intelligence headquarters, and the Haifa oil refinery.
Actually overwhelming and breaching Israel's layered air defenses in several places.
And signaling a willingness to target American regional infrastructure, Iran launches a strike against the U.S. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar.
A fragile ceasefire is finally brokered by the U.S. and Qatar on June 24, but the toll is incredibly heavy.
Iran reports over 1,000 military and civilian dead. Israel reports 28 dead from the missile impacts. The U.S. expends roughly 1/4 of its global stockpile of highly advanced missile interceptors.
But what about the nuclear program? The very thing this entire massive operation was designed to neutralize.
Pentagon estimates released after the war assessed that the strikes, despite utilizing bunker busters and destroying hundreds of facilities, only set back Iran's nuclear program by 1 to 2 years.
The largest military operation in the region in decades achieved a delay of 1 to 2 years.
That is exactly the same delay that was achieved peacefully by the diplomatic JCPOA agreement back in 2015. But this time it came at a massive human, financial, and strategic cost.
Which brings us to the final phase of our analysis: structural themes and historical echoes. When we synthesize this entire 80-year narrative, several profound academic concepts emerge.
The first is what international relations scholars call alliance inversion.
It is a textbook case study. You have deeply pragmatic partners, Israel and Iran, under the Shah, who, through a series of slow shifts, became principal warring adversaries.
Driven not merely by the theology of the 1979 revolution, but by a cascading series of geopolitical earthquakes: the end of the Cold War, the destruction of Iraqi power, and the collapse of the Arab state order.
But the concept that really explains the brutal escalation of the 2020s is the security dilemma, as outlined in the Baker 2017 thesis.
A security dilemma occurs when actions taken by one state to increase its own security inevitably cause reactions from other states, which in turn lead to a decrease in the original state's overall security.
Think about the post-October 7 campaign. By systematically destroying Iran's proxy ring of fire in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, Israel drastically increased its own immediate tactical security.
But in doing so, it entirely removed Iran's conventional deterrent.
And as a historical analogy, the sources compare this modern conflict to the Rome-Parthia rivalry of antiquity.
2,000 years ago, two great empires fighting over the exact same contested buffer zones. They used client kingdoms and proxy forces to bleed each other.
Israel, like the Roman Empire, possesses superior military technology and overwhelming force projection. Iran, like the Parthian Empire, relies on immense strategic depth and asymmetric capabilities.
We also see vital parallels to the India-Pakistan stability-instability paradox.
In South Asia, the mutual possession of nuclear weapons deterred large-scale conventional war, but ironically enabled decades of sub-conventional proxy conflict.
The Iran-Israel dynamic exhibited similar features for decades through the axis of resistance, but the June 2025 war violently broke that pattern.
It suggests that the stability-instability paradox has terrifying limits when one side's conventional deterrent is systematically annihilated.
So as we close out this deep dive, let's summarize this massive arc for you. We have watched this relationship evolve from a quiet intelligence triad under the Periphery Doctrine to covert arms deals during the Iran-Contra affair,
into decades of shadow wars fought with malware and targeted assassinations, and finally crossing the ultimate threshold into direct conventional ballistic missile warfare.
We saw how cold strategy initially dominated, only to slowly yield to the weight of ideology, and how proxy containment eventually failed under accumulated pressure.
And this brings us to a final unresolved question drawn directly from the academic sources. It is something for you to mull over as you watch the news going forward.
Let's hear it.
If a nation's entire conventional deterrent, its proxies, its militias, its forward defense, is systematically and ruthlessly destroyed by its adversaries, Does the cold, mathematical logic of state survival push them inevitably toward the ultimate nuclear threshold?
By winning the conventional war and destroying the axis of resistance, did the victors just inadvertently guarantee the very nuclear outcome they spent 20 years trying to prevent?
That is the structural reality we are left with.
A profound and deeply unsettling question to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the historical forces shaping our world. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the slow structural shifts beneath the surface, and we will catch you next time.